Welcome to Neat Runs. Today I'm going to be showing you what is possibly my favorite and definitely one of the most underrated trail running spots in the greater St. Louis area. The trail I'm referring to is actually two trails. It's the Lewis Trail and its counterpart, the Clark Trail out in Weldon Springs, Missouri. Not to be confused with the Lewis and Clark Trail, which is a singular historical trail spanning multiple states used by the great expeditioners Lewis and Clark as they crossed North America. No, this is the Lewis Trail and the Clark Trail. Yes, it confuses me too. This video will be combining and intercutting footage I shot of the trail in December, June, and in October. That way you can see the beautiful scenery from the perspective of multiple seasons. Lewis Trail is the longer loop that goes the full distance of the exterior. It's 8.2 miles. If you want to cut it short, however, you can use the Clark Trail to shorten it to a 5.2 mile loop. The trails take you through the forest over a diverse and challenging, yet well-maintained single track. There are also some pretty notable hill climbs, which eventually culminates in some great views. Yes, one of the main attractions here is that these trails offer some of the most scenic views in the St. Louis area, looking out over the bluffs of the Missouri River. And as an avid trail runner, the Lewis and Clark trails have been my home away from home for about as long as I've known about them. These trails have made me the runner that I am today. The terrain is just challenging enough to keep you on your toes. There are areas where you have to pay close attention or you're going to trip over a rock or a root. And the hill climbs are insane to run up. They're extreme enough to tire out even the strongest hill climber. But the concentration and perseverance required always leaves me feeling like I left it all out on the trail. One thing that's confused me for a long time about these trails is that I see a pretty big difference between the distance shown on online maps versus the distance that's officially quoted on the trail signs. As you can see here, on the sign for the trail, it says the Lewis Trail is 8.2 miles. But if you look on Google Maps, it shows it as 7.6 miles. My Garmin watch and Strava all consistently align to the 7.6 mile quote. Now that's a 0.6 mile difference, which can lead to a big difference in your pace per mile. It might explain why my pace per mile always looks really bad on Strava every time I run this. Maybe Strava thinks I only did 7.6 miles, but in actuality, it was 8.2. But all in all, I'm not sure what drives this difference. Maybe the Google Maps and the Strava edition don't account for the distance contained and the elevation gain and the elevation loss. Maybe they're only quoting the distance from point A to point B on a flat map, or as the crow flies, as some would say it. If you know the answer, please leave it in the comments, because I've been curious about this for a really long time. For this run, I went counterclockwise from the parking area, which I think is the main way that people take. The trail starts out with about 1 mile of relatively flat, wooded running. At a little over the first mile, you're going to come across this more open area that has benches. And then you're going to see your first, somewhat obstructed, view of the Missouri River. It looked especially nice with these fall colors. This is one of the areas that's normally pretty crowded when the weather's nice. As a matter of fact, the first 2.5 miles or so in either direction from the parking area are normally somewhat crowded if the weather's pretty good. There's not normally as many people after you get over that 2.5 mile mark. not long after you pass that open area with the benches, you'll find yourself finishing the first descent and about ready to start the first major hill climb of the expedition. As I mentioned, the hills on this trail can be really tough. I think a runner of any skill level would be slowed down by these hills. It's not just that they have a steep elevation profile, which they do. This first hill has you climbing about 132 feet, but they also can have really tough terrain. For example, this first hill is especially rocky. Be careful as you climb these hills. On the Lewis and Clark trails, when climbing hills, I have a strict don't look up policy. Sometimes you can get psyched out by looking up and seeing how much hill you have left to climb. So I tend to just look down and focus on the terrain, which is actually pretty essentially so that you don't take a wrong step or trip. But as soon as you do get to the top of that first hill, the first great set of overlooks is right around the corner. And the views are beautiful indeed. This is just one of many overlook spots. You can see people on the Katy Trail down below. From here, it's not far to the next set of overlooks. This next spot has two overlooks very close to one another. One to the right and one to the left over by the main trail. This one to the right was swarmed with bees when I visited in the fall, so I didn't stay long. Nothing like being swarmed with bees while standing on a cliff. After those two overlook areas, it's time to run downhill and lose all that elevation you gained. In this next section of the trail, you'll find yourself crossing a few creeks. Times that I've been here when it had rained recently, there's normally a more substantial stream to cross, but normally it isn't too much to worry about. It can also be very muddy around this area. Then at the 2.8 mile mark, you get to that fork in the road where you have to decide if you want to continue down the Lewis Trail or take the shorter Clark Trail. First, let's take a look at what you're up against if you take the shorter Clark Trail. If you continue straight to go down the shorter Clark Trail, you may be taking the shorter route out of the woods, but you still have a monster hill to climb. You're going to find yourself going about 0.4 miles on relatively flat ground before you get to the foot of this hill. All in all, the hill is about 120 feet of elevation gain, and it's another steep one. It's also very rocky. Definitely another don't look up type of moment. But after you've beaten that monster hill, you'll still have about 1.7 miles until you're back at the parking lot. Be one more smaller hill, but nothing crazy. Let's time warp back to the fork in the road to see what the longer Lewis Trail has in store for us. After you take the right turn to stay on the Lewis Trail, it's just a short 0.4 miles before you'll find yourself up against the biggest hill on either the Lewis Trail or the Clark Trail. This hill has you climbing a very sudden 154 feet. But if you can handle that, you can handle everything up ahead. This section of the Lewis Trail, right at the 3.8 mile mark, has my favorite overlook of them all. That's correct. This is the overlook that you see in the Neat Runs intro. And it's the most remote one out here, so there's less odds you're going to run into any other people. Then, at about the 4.5 mile mark from the start, after you get down the hill from that second overlook, you get to what I think might be the most confusing part of the trail. There's what appears to be a fork in the trail, one path going to the right, and the other path, which isn't super easy to notice if you just keep running straight, goes to the left. Well, it turns out that the trail that goes to the left is the right way to go. Even though there's some single track through the woods if you go on the rightmost trail, it eventually just fades away just to leave you lost and confused. This is a lesson that I learned the hard way back in December, when the false trail was especially easy to accidentally drift down. Let's face it, trail running on your own can be pretty dangerous. That's why it's always better to go on an unfamiliar trail with a friend or with somebody who's been out there before. But fortunately, since I had made this mistake back in December, I knew the right way to go. Not long after I avoided the dangers of being lost in the woods, I confronted another one of the dangers of trail running: tripping and falling. The video was being shot at 2x speed on my GoPro, so I slowed it down. I definitely took a little damage, but in the end it wasn't that bad. That leads us to our next trail running lesson. You really have to pay attention to the terrain. If you get tired or bored, you can easily become complacent and forget to watch the trail, which can lead to tripping and falling. That is one downside of the Lewis and Clark trails. They are rocky and there are lots of roots, but if you pay attention, it just keeps it interesting. There is a long stretch back after that last overlook that we saw. Mentally, this is one of the toughest parts of the run. After seeing that last overlook, it's easy to feel a sense that you've seen all the great sights of the Lewis Trail and the Clark Trail, and your run is almost complete. Well, it's true, you've seen all the great sights, and you've climbed probably 2 monster hills at this point, but there is still nearly 4 miles left to run. And it is 4 miles through the most remote and most quiet wooded stretch. It can wear on you psychologically. First few times I was out on these trails, the stretch really got to me. There were moments when I thought that the trails felt like they were never ending. They were at least considerably longer than I was thinking they were, but perseverance pays off. While it is a somewhat long stretch back, there isn't that much hill action and it can be pretty peaceful. Before you know it, you'll be hearing the sounds of the cars driving on the highway and you know you're getting close to the end of the trail. The trail ends with a final ascent into the sunny, open parking lot. Let's do a quick pros and cons of the Lewis Trail and the Clark Trail. First, the pros. The trails offer a great flexibility mileage-wise. I would recommend starting with the 5-mile loop and building up incrementally as you're able to successfully complete each loop safely and comfortably. Next pro, the hills and terrain are great for training. The hills might be a con for some people, but I view these hills as a big pro. I don't get a hill workout like this anywhere else. And the final pro, the sights are great. They're just as good as Castlewood, if not better, and it's less crowded. Now let's talk cons. First con, this trail can be very muddy certain times of the year. Around January and February, when it gets wet outside, the trail can stay muddy for weeks at a time, which can make the trails very difficult to traverse. Next con, while it's not as crowded as Castlewood, it can still get kind of crowded. Usually the most crowded place is the parking lot though. Sometimes I notice the parking lot is so packed that you can't even find a spot, but once you get on the trails, you barely see anybody. It's because the trails are so vast. People are very spaced out. The amount of crowding that you saw in this video is about as crowded as I've ever seen the trails. And the final con, the trails can be rocky and there's a lot of hidden impediments, which can cause you to trip or twist your ankle. You have to commit yourself to paying close attention to the trail if you don't want to get injured. But I kind of like that about the trail. All in all, these two trails are seriously some of my favorites in the St. Louis area, if not my favorite. I would recommend it for runners, hikers, walkers, just about anybody, but keep in mind there's some tough hills and these are pretty tough trails. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Slowly build up using the various loop options available. Thanks everybody for watching.